of what it is we're proposing. Oh, thank you, Michelle. I am always forgetting to record. So I'm going to start with because basically the whole first section, oh, hey, Piper, is like background and why we need this and that sort of thing. And of course, it's in a Google Docs. You can, of course, look at those sections on your own time. This will be one of the things that's worked at as part of a workshop at the European Symposium. And then our colleagues in the Netherlands have been working on assessing what types of tools are needed for different use cases. And we'll probably add a tool section to this as well. So I'm just going to kind of cruise through, and if there's something you want to comment on, just stop me. You can also pull this up on your own. I can put the link in the chat if you want to.
I put the link. Do you want to share?
Yeah,
your screen?
Oh, shoot, sorry. That does make it easier. You don't have to read my mind. I haven't had my second cup of coffee yet, so I'm going to blame that. Oh, cool. Is that what you put in the chat, Michelle?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Thank you. All right, so the first part is just talking about classifying standardized assessment instruments. I will probably continue to refer to this level as survey because that's what we've been doing for the last couple of years. But when I say survey, it's basically at the level of standardized assessment instrument. And then from the work that Piper's been doing, we've talked about classifying these into two primary classes. So a standardized collection instrument and a psychometrically validated instrument. And so their definitions for each of these, you guys can read faster than I can talk. So I'll let you read those. And then, there's some discussion about, not only is there a difference in design, but in how the data should be represented. And that's something we've talked about a lot as well, relative to the psychometrically validated instruments having scores and things that are important considerations in addition to maybe looking at question answer pairs. So I'm going to pause here, give you a few beats to kind of skim this on your own, and then let me know if you have any questions, comments, or additions. I can also try to make it bigger if it's not sure how easy this is to read, but it doesn't let a lot of subtlety. Okay, that's really big. I don't know if I can do a custom. There we go. Let's try. Right, does anybody need more time? Are there any comments? Piper, especially from you, because I know you've worked a lot on these definitions. Is there anything you think we might need to refine here, or is this good?
Yeah, Nicole, I think this looks really good. And I think this or a similar document will probably be sort of an evolving living document, right? As we
Yes.
go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. This
Yeah.
looks
I would
great.
definitely agree with that.
Huh.
Anyone else? Okay. So we'll move on.
We also
Oh.
summarize how our approach to mapping survey data elements in the AI Ready project, and we submitted the manuscript to Amy. I don't know if we'll get in, but
Okay.
a lot of it is what we shared in this working group.
Great. And then, so you've got a manuscript. Is it also going through the vocabulary team for approval? I don't think it's going to be in this vocabulary update or the one that just went through, right? But it's something that you've also talked to the vocabulary group about?
Yes.
Okay.
We submitted the ones that we couldn't map due to the
Yeah.
gap in the terminology, which included vision measurement, MoCA scale, and there are various different time scale and MoCA terms, as well as just generic survey instruments where you have to evaluate both the question and answer term in order to come up with the proper terminology.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. And then, yeah, when we get to so we put in the three options for mapping, right? So the fact, the question answer pair, and then the triplet. Have you had a chance to read through that section and see how that matches like what your approach was?
Yeah, I don't know if the one thing that we had to put extra was the qualifier ID. I think you cover that, right? So
Okay.
if the vision care measurement is for it's using specific instrument with with the left eye or right eye, there was no way to put the left or right, and we used the qualifier concept ID to specify whether it was for the left or the right.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Stephanie. And then, sorry, I'm going to say your name wrong. Alaha, did you have a question? Saw your hand up, then went back
Hello.
down.
Yeah, good morning. Sorry. Yeah, just you can call me Ella.
Okay.
Thank you. And just I was curious why it's just psychometric surveys are separated. I read the text for the reasoning, but like all the other errors are really the same for SDCI, except these psychometric surveys.
Yeah, I think it's basically because in terms of how we do, well, it's a couple things. So it's differences, and I'm sure Piper, you will chime in and elaborate if I miss anything. But part of it is in how they're developed. So the psychometric instruments are basically trying to measure a construct that you can't measure directly. So, it's hard to get a direct measure of suicidal ideation, but you can ask several questions that when combined together can measure the underlying construct of suicidal ideation. So they're basically developed very specifically to measure those types of things. When we think of things of more the standardized collection instrument, it's basically trying to ask questions in a standardized way so that you can pull data across participants and you've asked them the same thing the same way. So these are more questions on, your background health, where have you lived, do you smoke, do you drink, things like that. And so you're trying to measure or get at different things. And then one of the other differences is to get at these constructs, you also have the development, you have as an outcome scores. And so lots of times you don't necessarily want or need to map the question answer pairs. You want to map a score indicating high risk or low risk or things like that. So they're different enough in development and how they're analyzed that in terms of how they'll be mapped to OMOP, it makes sense to separate them out.
Okay, thank you.
Piper, oh, go ahead.
May I just add another question? Like, does it like for prims and proms, it would be the same if we have such surveys, like patient-reported measures?
Right.
Or...
Yeah. So patient-reported measures are generally under the standardized collection instrument. Prims, I'm less familiar with. Piper, do you want to elaborate? Can you add anything I didn't cover?
Sure.
And then you can ask your question.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
So I'm not familiar with prim. What is a prim?
Prim is patient-reported measures.
And how is it
And
different than
one
a
is
prom?
patient outcome measures. So we have some outcomes and we have some thing reported by the patients.
Oh, okay. Okay. So yeah, so getting back to like the major classes, the main difference between this sort of standardized data collection instrument and a psychometrically validated instrument is in what is most important in terms of representing them. And for a psychometrically validated assessment, that is designed specifically to measure some clinical phenomena like depression, anxiety, you know, risk of fall or pressure ulcer. And so the most important element there is the score, right? Because the score, it yields a metric. Standardized data collection instruments are they might have a focus. There might be a topic that they're focused on gathering information about, but they have not been empirically validated to measure anything. And so you couldn't compare results of survey results from two different people and make any sort of claim about one is more depressed or less depressed or at more risk for suicide, et cetera. It's really just collecting information in a standard way. And so, at the end of the day, they're just two fundamentally different kinds of things. A psychometrically validated assessment is much more like a laboratory test. So, and I know there's a lot of terms used to describe the universe of instruments, prims, proms, COAs, measures.
We are so acronym heavy. It makes me crazy sometimes.
Yeah. And probably the way one group uses the term prom might even be different than the way another group uses it. So I think part of our one of the things that we're working on right now is a paper, and one of our goals there is to just be really clear about sort of this universe of things we call surveys or assessment instruments, and how we can sort of carve them out naturally at the joints, and what that means in terms of how we represent them in OMOP or in any system for that matter.
Yeah, so we basically just want to come to an agreement for how we're going to use this in OMOP and share, basically create a common language that we can share, and we know what this means in this context.
Thank you so much. That was very good.
Oh, good.
But I'm glad that helps. And then, Nicole, my question was this.
Yeah.
Do you think in order to capture the full meaning of the observation, right? The question, the answer, and the interpretation, is there a need for us to also capture not the exact answer list, but the the scale of the answer list, right? Is it a Likert scale? Is it just a nominal scale? Is there any need for us to capture that in the observation?
I think, yeah, I think, and again, I know some of you have direct experience with the mapping. I know Diane, you have, so you might be able to answer differently. From the conversations I've had with, and Alexander, you too, from the vocabulary. I was gonna say from the conversations I've had with Anna, there things like that are part of what you see in Lincoln SNOMED. So I think by virtue of what question answer pair you map it to, that concept is indicative of what scale this is coming from. I don't think we need another piece of information to indicate that.
Okay, so you're referring to the instrument as the scale.
Well, no, like if it's a Likert scale, what you're mapping to indicates it's a Likert scale. Like this is a 5 from the Likert scale kind of thing.
So I'm trying to think of, and this might not be, I'm trying to think of the difference between, so say we have two questions or two assessments, multiple assessments. We have the same question in multiple assessment instruments.
Mhm.
And the only difference, and we have in one assessment instrument says, you're rating it on a 3-point Likert scale, right? From, so not at all true to absolutely positively true, right? For me, whatever.
Mhm.
And is there any need to capture the fact that someone has a score? Are we capturing the numeric score, right? So score of 3 on a 3-point scale means absolutely true of me. And on a 7-point scale would mean neutral.
Mhm.
Or is that being addressed by the interpretation piece, right?
I would think my gut is that this is being addressed by an interpretation, but I also think this goes back to this being a living document. Like I think we have to kind of come to agreement on what we think like the basic framework for this is, and then see how it's used and if additional needs like that evolve. So like one of the things that's also in here is getting the metadata recorded. So maybe this is something that gets included in the metadata that, Likert scales are to 3 or Likert scales are to 5 or, things like that. But I think there's some things, I don't know. Oh, Diane, go ahead, because you have more direct experience. Oh, if you're talking, you're muted.
Sorry, I can give you an example of how we've mapped those types of questions with the data that we have. And I don't know if this follows 100% OMOP mapping rules. But if we had a question that, like you said, it's a Likert scale, but if it's not a validated instrument where you can know for sure that people are using the exact same Likert scale in 2 different studies, but asking the same question, those would end up in the observation domain. We would have a value as number, which could be your 1, 2, 3 or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it is. And then the value is string, we've put in what that actually means. So whether it's very possible, probable, or not possible, whatever the text version of those answers are. So it's all the information is there because we didn't put that type of metadata anywhere. We weren't really sure exactly where to put it. So we put it in the record itself.
Okay.
But just to give you context of how we've at least tackled it, because you're right, it's very important to know what those 1, 2, 3s stand for, especially if it's not a validated instrument where you have that documentation to go back to.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially like the unit of measure, right? When you report a lab
Mhm.
test and you
Yeah.
say 10 to the negative 12th, well, that is at microliters, milliliters, liters, right? And
Yep.
so the number isn't meaningful without the units. So,
Yep.
okay. And you know, for not an issue for psychometrically validated assessments because one, those we are like more likely to be able to add those to LOINC and have standard concept IDs,
Mhm.
right? And that can be tracked back. But again, for questionnaires, right, for these standardized data collection instruments, and I'm also I'm also trying to understand what the plan is for translating the interpretation, right? So if we ask somebody, you know, think of questions where you're answering agree to, you know, I agree, or very true of me, not at all true of me, or very true of my situation, not at all. And then you have Likert scales of various ranges. Is there going to be, do you envision a standard translation for each type of Likert scale? For example, you know, so somebody says, you know, on a 7-point Likert scale, they're 7, very true of me. I exercise regularly, whatever that question is. What do you do? Do you see what I'm saying? How are you translating the interpretation for each item, for each response value?
So you mean in terms of categorizing somebody as an exerciser or non-exerciser, or?
Yeah, well, or yes, so whatever the thing is that the question is measuring, right?
Mhm.
How are we
Yeah,
capturing the meat, the interpretation? That's the
so
piece.
yeah, I see what you're saying, because there's sort of the outright, you know, the question was how frequent I exercise weekly, and then somebody says, yes, that's very true of me. So on one hand, that's captured right in that question answer pair. And then you're asking, okay, that's great, you've got your question answer pair, but if you want to put this into you know, basically define what the fact is, what's the fact? So is it I'm a weekly exerciser, or does it say something about, I don't know, the frequency of activity, or exercisers, not exercisers? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. So
Okay, yeah.
how do you sort of standardize that interpretation? And should we,
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
or
I'm not sure about standard, like, I guess what I would see this as, and again, Alexander, from the vocabulary standpoint, or anyone else who have a different opinion, please chime in. I guess what I'm looking for at the basic is, the question was, do you exercise weekly? They said, that strongly applies to me. So that's my question answer pair. And then I guess to me, the fact would be exercises weekly. I don't know that I describe it as a scale. I feel like when you get to things like that, it's more when you're ready to do the analyses, how do you roll these up? So let's say you created the 7-point scale, but you're going to use that 7-point scale to come up with 3 categories. Never exercises weekly, sometimes exercises weekly, always exercises weekly. But then that becomes like a rolled up derived variable. And I don't know that that's something you would map, or if you wanted to map it, you would map it separately. So this is just me thinking out loud, but I'd be interested in, other thoughts. But that's how I think of it.
yeah, and I'm thinking from the perspective of trying to use the data set. I don't know. I mean, we're talking about interpretation being really important, and it is for questions like, has anyone ever told you you have cancer, history of cancer, right? But for some of these other things,
Yeah.
I'm wondering if the need would be, if we would need a field to report what is the response scale, right? So
Mm-hmm.
response scale
Yeah, which the
is
scale we've
Likert
talked
5.
about. Yeah, so I think,
Yep.
and there's the option, what Diane said, it can go into the observation, or we can decide that it's part of the metadata. But yeah, and I guess part of the thing we have to think about is what makes the data reusable or poolable versus how you'll analyze the data. And, so if we look at going from, okay, how, do you exercise at least once a week, and the scale of exercising, and everybody, say for the sake of argument, maps to that 7-point scale, and then I can pull that data, and if I want to roll it up into a exercise or non-exerciser class, I can do something like that. Or if people do it at different scales, I can pull based on the question answer pair and then try to roll up the scales. Stephanie, what were you thinking?
So you could easily map a question like how often do you exercise, and the answer could be categorical, like daily, weekly, uh, uh, that type of thing, or certain number of hours. So all those categorical answer could also be mapped and be used. Yeah.
And I feel like with the questions like that, that's what we're more likely to ask, but maybe I could be wrong because I'm biased by what we do in Connect. But it's much more similar to what you just said, Stephanie. It's based on number of days a week, number of hours a day, and then that's how it's recorded. But ultimately, we also use all that information to come up with a category of exercise score. So so you've got the step of mapping that pair, but then, pooling analyses or whatever, then we'd come up with scores for these individuals based on it. Wouldn't necessarily map the scores because that's, at least in the context of the standardized collection instrument, in my head, I'm thinking, I just want to map the questions so I can pool them. And then if I need to do rolling up of variables or other things to create a score, I do that after I've pooled data. And I could be wrong. Maybe that's not the best way to think about it, but that's how I do.
But if you wanted to, I think you could so like in Mocha, you have the times it took for you to draw a circle, or times it took to remember the 3 words or whatever it is. But then they also put a total score based on all your assessments. So it's possible to map those data and then put it in, and you could just search it and use it too.
Right. And I think with things that are scores that are part of the instrument, having a separate thing to map the score makes sense. I think for some things, these are more, post-collection analysts, analyses that, specialists in these areas do, for determining levels of activity or making recommendations about activity, things like that. I don't know that that's necessary. I mean, you can map it, but I don't know that's necessary sort of this first tier of just getting to the place where we can harmonize the data and, pool across studies.
Well,
Oh, go ahead, Alexander.
yeah, so all these questions are very valid, right? And the point is that for most of these semantic problems and spaces, there is now a decision on what the standard representation should be, right? So we definitely know how to map conditions. We know how to map some of the observations, but most of them not really, right? Say we know how to deal with the history of, we know how to do the smoking status, but the rest is like not really covered, and we just have the whole entirety of different source representations at the moment, and that would be the task for us to actually define what the standard representation would be. But yeah, that is very relevant.
Yeah, I agree, Alex.
Alexander.
And I just think it's so, I'm starting to think that it's important that we have a field to capture the response scale I'm worried about how to analyze it if we don't have the response scale, but that might be something we can play with some specific use cases, right?
Well, yeah, I think we could play with it with specific use cases, and I think we can also, as a group, make the decision, do we want to make it part of the observation, like what Diane was talking about? Is it part of the metadata? So if we're at the level of agreeing we need to capture it, then we just need to decide where in the model it makes the most sense to capture it. Craig?
Yeah,
What
so
were your thoughts?
yeah, a couple points here. From a data user perspective, to me, the most important thing is that we don't change the meaning from what was actually asked. That whatever, we decide as far as mapping or capturing the data, that keeps the original meaning as best as possible. The other thing is, my understanding is we're talking about sort of two different scales. We're talking about one where the scale represents something, like exercise, no exercise, some exercise. Those are then categories or groupings, whereas the other type of scale I'm thinking is like, like, do you feel pain 1 to 10, something like that. Am I understanding that correctly? There's kind of two different scaling systems I'm hearing.
Yeah, and maybe more than that. So I think, so you've got categorical responses, and then you've got, scales that are part of the psychometrically validated instruments. And then, like you said, you have scales that can be part of the standardized collection instrument, but, that are somewhat arbitrary, so I am creating the scale of 1 to 5 for, never, frequently, sometimes, that sort of thing. And it's not necessarily for an official calculation. It's just to give you an idea of the scope or relative degrees, of something.
Yeah, and so when I've done this analysis before, I create my own groups. So if we're talking about like exercise, I'll do ever exercise versus never, or I'll do vigorous exercise versus, less so. And so depending on what I'm trying to analyze, I'll draw those groups as I decide. And so that's why I don't think doing any sort of roll up before it gets to the analyst makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, the other thing is when we're talking about the ranges, I mean, or not the ranges, the scales, in the measurement table, and I believe in observation table too, there is a field for range low, range high, something like that. I don't have the exact
reference range.
Thank you.
Reference range. Yeah.
And maybe that would be the way to capture what the scale is, because that way you don't need to change it from an instrument to instrument. You just have that information there. And as an analyst, I need to look at that as I should. And maybe that works to capture it.
Yeah, I think the reference range typically, and I'm not a biomedical person, but I think the reference range is really more about what's considered the normal range, right? Low and high.
Right, but
so
all these
go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. All these small workarounds won't work, right? Because the way that is modeled in the sources is much more different than the measurement domain is, right?
Okay.
Yes.
So one solution could be if we really come up with a entirely new comprehensive table that actually supports all these sort of tricks. Or we do what we did before, we say the cancer entity attribute value type of data, right? So we do pre-coordinate all the attributes that are actually relevant. And how it's done, say, in the NACER vocabulary. So you have the definition of the schema, which is, again, the version of the terminology and some scale context as well, right? So you would put it into the concept if you really want to have it in place. But this is not trivial, right? Because you have much more attributes than you have even in cancer.
So Alex, to your point, and Alana, I see you have your hand up, so I'll say this really quick, but you bring up a really good point, Alex, which is, have we explored a possibility of creating a assessment or survey specific data structure, so it's not going into observation? And if so, what's the backstory on that? And have the powers that be at OMOP supported that, or not so much?
Well, it's not going to be easy because there was one attempt with the version 6 when we actually released the survey conduct, which was very different to what we're talking about. That was the sort of metadata layer of what specific instruments were used and how they were used and so on and so forth. So it didn't actually meant to store the data itself rather than some metadata. But yeah, this is one of the ideas on the table, but it's not yet developed or like explained. This is just like the conversations, the same as we have now had in the past.
Yeah. Ella, why don't you go, and then I'll circle back to Alexander's comment.
Yeah, might be my response not that much related to Alex. So if just I wanted to say that when we have categorical way of response, like for example, high, medium, and low in 3 levels, and another survey might use 7 steps, just it came to my mind kind of normalization it happened if we consider like 7 steps in comparison to 3 steps, like from 0 to 3 and 0 to 7, and normalize it to, for example, 0 to 1, something, all of them. So it can be kind of a standard. Just, it might be, I'm not sure, but just I wanted to share it.
Yeah, I'll go, and then I'll let others. From my perspective, that would be a post analytic thing. So like what Craig was saying, I think we want to keep as much as what the original questionnaire or document intended. So we don't necessarily want to lose a resolution of a scale of 7 versus the resolution you have at a scale of 3. But then that'll, so yeah, but then at the same time, do we, do we have mapping 1 through 3, but then you see in the metadata that 3 was the max of that scale, and you have mapping 1 to 7, and see in the metadata that 7 was the max of that scale. Go ahead, Alex, because I do a lot of thinking out loud. So I appreciate the feedback. Yeah.
I also wanted to reflect on the Piper's thinking about whether it's even feasible and do we have enough authority and so on and so forth to push it forward. So look, 5 years ago, the oncology extension or oncology module, or currently the part of CDM, didn't even exist, right? And we've been sitting in the same working group, talking the same things, right? So I think this working group has the whole capacity and authority and so on and so forth to come up with a new table and make it part of the core OMOP CDM in the future, if that would be the solution that we're going to suggest, right?
And then I guess part of my question would be, what tables do we need? Like, is the addition of a metadata table where you would include, what we've talked about before, the name of the instrument, if the instrument is consistently scaled, you could say, Likert score 1 to 3, blah, blah, blah. Like, is a metadata table enough of a table to add? Is there something else we need to add? I think from my perspective, I definitely see this as an iterative process. I don't think we're going to land on perfection in one go. But is there something we could put out in in this calendar year that will give people who can't wait for, another table to be developed or things like that, to be able to start getting their surveys into OMOP and have, not be siloed, be doing them in a consistent way that gives us the chance to pool. So kind of like, what's our lowest hanging fruit for the first iteration based on, what's already part of the OMOP model, plus maybe the metadata table. Does it make sense to approach it from that? Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we put a pin in it and continue development of an additional table. But I do know there's a lot of interest and need for having some standards to start with, so we can get out of mapping these surveys in silos. Craig?
Muted. Yeah. So I think if we're talking about standardizing them on how the data is depicted, I think that's solvable. If we take out the idea of trying to pool the data and bring them all to on equal scales and equivalency. So I do think sort of how standardizing how data collected and how it's depicted as far as in a form or a structure, I think that makes sense instead of trying to figure out how they can all be pulled together. I think that's where many of the problems are coming from.
Yeah, and I mean, there is a desire to pool in the sense that, again, kind of circling back to like, why do we even want to map to OMOP? But I think you've got the ability, if you can pull, say, on the question or question answer pair and not necessarily the fact, then you pool on that, and then okay, these are 1 to 3, these are 1 to 5,
Right.
and then you come up with a derived variable. And anybody doing their analyses could potentially do that separately. And then again, if we end up at a point where we want to share or map derived variables, then that's maybe something we go back and look at. If somebody does all this work to harmonize and creates derived, then, do we consider, how do we share or consider mapping those?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Kurt.
Yeah, it makes, I think the analysis would then be portable from each data set to each one. The interpretation just change when you start to take into account the difference in scaling, and which I think from a data science perspective, I think is reasonable, at least at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, there's always, I guess, loss of information. Once you leave your own survey, right, there's some loss of information when you harmonize. You always have to harmonize at least once, and there's potentially a loss there. And then there's potentially loss of information when you pool, because you have to roll up scales. And I think that's just a fact of pooling data. It's not like this doesn't happen with EHR as well. So it's sort of like, okay, what resolution do you give up in terms of the effort of, increasing your sample size or getting data from multiple countries or things like that? Okay, so Diane, you had your hand up next.
I just wanted to agree that I think the lowest hanging fruit is finding a common way to get the question answer pairs at least into OMOP somehow. And I understand there's a lot of moving parts, but I'm just afraid if we concentrate on getting that perfect, model, then it's going to take us longer to get there. I think there's probably a couple of little things, especially the scales. If there's a difference in possible scales to be able to put that information somewhere. But I'm of the opinion that the best way to move forward is to do it in chunks. And I think you're right. I think the lowest hanging fruit is getting those question answer pairs in, and then we can move on to the next iteration of updates and making it better.
Yeah, thanks, Diane. And then Piper?
So Nicole, I was just going to comment on the metadata table, right? I feel like I don't know that we want or need an additional metadata table, because I think that's what the vocabulary tables are, right? We already have, through the vocabulary tables, we can represent assessments and surveys. What we need, I think the challenge we have with the existing vocabulary tables is we need a harmonized assessment model, right? And we talked about that before. So I think that the representation of the survey itself fits in fine with using vocabulary tables, right? We just add each survey to our survey, whichever survey vocabulary we're going to use, or create a custom one, whatever. And now that I think about it, in that table, we will capture the response scale, right? Here's the question, here's the quote unquote answer list, which is a response scale, Likert 5, frequency, whatever. So I think that the solution for that piece is definitely going to be addressed by the vocabulary table and how we use those. And I guess now that I think about that, there is no need in the observation to actually capture the scale because we have that quote unquote metadata in the vocabulary file, right? So, and then was it Craig who was saying, that way we keep everything captured as is, right? We don't infer anything beyond what the data says. And then the analyst can use that however they intend to do their analysis, right? When they pool the data.
Yeah, I think, there's definitely, we don't want to try to estimate every way the data could possibly be used because we'd make ourselves nuts, but getting it to where it's usable and then the analysts can make those decisions, is where we're trying to get to. So thank you. And then Ella?
Yeah, so just I wanted to follow up with what I was saying about the scaling, that you said it's after analysis, that it can be a part of interpretation, that, for example, what's meant 1.5 in a 7-step question for interpretation versus what does it mean for 3-step question. So it's a part of interpretation, but that gives a standardization. And even there might be some weights applicable if we have different scales for interpretation.
Yeah, and I think that's the third piece we have to consider. So, again, in terms of trying to offer sort of that lowest hanging fruit, that question and answer pair is probably the easiest thing. And then we have to think about how we want to do interpretation. So is interpretation in the eye of the beholder, meaning that the person who's mapping this survey says, well, on my scale of 7, this person marked a 7, so this is what a 7 means. Or, is there some intermediary step where we try to harmonize those scales? So I think it's definitely something that should be part of the discussion. I think probably what we need to do in the next couple of weeks is triage what we want to be part of this first proposal, and then go from there.
Yeah,
thanks, Ella. All right, this has been a great discussion. I really appreciate everyone who's on the call sharing. It's really helpful to get the multiple perspectives. We've got 9 minutes left, so we haven't made it super far in this, but I think this discussion has been helpful and affects the other sections. So I think with the amount of time we have left, is there another section we should look at the time, or is there any further discussion to be had on what we've been talking about with sort of the goals for this first proposal? Alex?
Well, I still have one of the definition question, right? So, but probably I will put it in writing here in the document. But in short, the question is, so say there is the UK biobank data, right? And a lot of stuff is directly asked from the patient as the survey staff, but there is something that is usually filled in by the doctor, and there is something that is exactly modeled as a question answer, but there is still something that is modeled more as a registry type of thing, but still it preserves the same structure and the same meaning. So the question is whether it's going to be in the scope of this effort or not, and how do we actually define the line. So let me put it in writing, but this is one of the...
Okay. Yeah, and I'm trying, do we have this in here? Yeah, I'll have to, unless we say it. Yeah, there is a longer, more, and I don't know if it made it into the proposal. There is a a general definition at the level of just standardized assessment instrument that covers, all the different ways that the data can be obtained. And I think, again, because it's a question answer pair, it can be collected by the clinician, it can be reported by a family member, it can be reported by the individual. So I do think our goal is to include those. I will check and see whether that definition's at the beginning. If not, I'll add it into this second section. But it covers that. So, I mean, please include your comment, because A, it'll help me know if I'm trying to answer the right question, and B, it'll remind me to update that definition. Anything else? All right, so this is posted, the link's in the chat. It's also in an email I sent out the other week. Please continue looking at this. We've got, I think, 2 more meetings before the European Symposium that we can continue to discuss and make updates so that we kind of have a revised draft. And again, that kind of focuses on our first iteration and that lower hanging fruit. So if, oh, yes, Ella.
Yeah, just I wanted to know, the other session I attended, I was supposed to collaborate with Piper for the paper or something like this proposal, but I don't know how to communicate and collaborate. Yeah.
Okay. My email should be on the list, and you know what? I will add you to, we have a Google Doc that I've shared, so I will add you to that, so you'll have access to it. How's that?
Yeah, that's great.
You put your email address in the chat.
Oh, okay, for sure.
Yeah.
And how do you pronounce your name?
It's Ella, but you may call me Ella for simplicity. Like, basically, people call me Ella.
And how do you pronounce it? How is it really said?
It's Ella.
Ella.
Ella. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
All right, well, thank you, Ella, for bringing that back up. And all right, well, thanks everybody for joining us today. I will see you next time. In the meantime, again, you have access to the document. Please feel free to add your thoughts and comments, and have a great rest of your week. And hopefully you're warm and dry. And then at least here it's 20 and snowing now in Kentucky. And on Friday, it's supposed to be 70. So I guess enjoy the roller coaster that is spring. Bye.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thank you. I shared my emails. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Ella.